Hello and welcome to FHIR subscriptions. This is going to be the reference implementation walkthrough video. So this is for Connectathon 29 here in January of 2022. Let's jump right in. So here I just have the web page for subscriptions.argo.run. Again, there's links everywhere, but this is the page that will bring up the hosted version of the user interface. I will note there are a lot of links on this page as well, feedback, documentation about the software, and different connectathons and everything else. So if this is a relatively easy URL to remember to get access to everything else. I will suggest the documentation is here as well that kind of talks about what all of this is, but you're watching this video, so we're going to cover a lot of that information here for you. The tabs across, this is just a React TypeScript application, nothing too fancy. Navigation here across the top, some status information. We're not connected right now, so we're not connected, and just some different things we can play with. So we'll start in configuration. We have this first section here, which is all about FHIR R4, and you can see there's a matching section here for FHIR R5. Generally speaking, you're probably going to use one or the other. There's a switch for it down here. But this is just where you set up your FHIR endpoint, if you have additional auth headers, what prefer header you want, things like that. Again, you'll only need one or the other, depending on what you're doing, and that is this switch here. So when it's off, we're using R5, and when it's on, we're using R4. There are some other configuration toggles here. If we're displaying things, popping things up in the UI for when you're getting host messages, if we're logging them to the console, light theme, dark theme for different things. This last one, skipping the server capabilities check. When we connect, we're going to check the FHIR server to see if it supports, getting a subscription topic and writing a subscription and all those different things. If you're working on your server implementation and have a working implementation but not a capability statement, you can tell it to skip that check. And then again, first is this warning, which I'm supposed to highlight, saying that do not push any actual patient information here. That's not allowed. This is a public server with no security, so please only use test data. And then, as I said, links. There is this option down at the very bottom, and I put it down there on purpose. This is the client host URL. This is part of the internal running of the software. It's a thing that stands up REST endpoints so that the server can talk to them. You only want to change this if you are running this piece yourself. So if you are, disconnected from the internet and have cloned all these repos and you're doing all these things, then you can change this to match. Otherwise, that's why it's at the very bottom of the screen. So what we're going to do is we'll use R5 today, and we'll hit connect. And all these things are going to work exactly the same whether we're using R4 or R5, but we could see there was a little connected message, and now we can see that our blue dots are telling us that we are nicely connected. So the first thing is this patient REST server scenario. And this is kind of the walkthrough guided tour that we want to use as the base test scenario for the Connectathon. There are documentations here describing it, but the long and short is we are doing a single patient encounter REST hook notification. So consumer app, kind of the perennial patient admission example that we've been using through everything else. So the first step here is a simple one. We're just getting a list of subscription topics from the server. I do want to show here all the different things on the cards for this UI. So we can see we can show or hide the contents. The go is to actually do it. We can copy whatever text is shown to the clipboard. But we can also see here's the exact request URL. Here's the actual response that came back. So we can see we got a bundle. It was a search set. We have a subscription topic resource, and all the details of that. So if you wanted to pull this into something else, you can go ahead and copy it to the clipboard, and that way you have access to this in other things. And of course, you can always copy paste everything else. But in this case, all we need is the info. Since we're doing patient encounter, we do need to select a patient or create one. So we can see if we need to create one, we can do that. In our case, we can also search. And we have a Testy McTestface version 5. And we'll use that patient. Same thing, we can see all of our requests, responses, everything else. Automatically, since we're using the UI, it went and asked for a REST endpoint. And this is that thing I was talking about with the client host and the configuration. We're running in a web page. Web page can't stand up an HTTP server. And so this went and created this endpoint based on this UID at this publicly available endpoint or website. So then we get to actually create our subscription. So we have some options here, not too many because again, this is a pretty on Rails guided scenario, but we can pick if we want it to be empty ID only or full resource. If we did have additional headers we wanted to put in, we could do that here. I don't, so we can create the subscription. Same thing, as you can see, we have our request URL, we have our request data, so this is what we posted to the server, and then we have the response data that you can see it went and filled in the ID, and it changed it to the status of requested and things like that. So here you can see all of the details on that resource and make it kind of easier for you as you're doing your development. This next step happened automatically while we were looking, and this was waiting on the client on the handshake. So in the data, we can see what actually happened is the server sent a handshake to our endpoint, which I don't think actually gets posted anywhere here because it doesn't need to. But this endpoint that we created up here got this handshake, and we can see it's a subscription notification bundle, and it's just a status requested. The subscription was in requested state. This is a handshake. There have been no events. There are no events in this notification, but this is the subscription and this is the topic that we're using. So nothing too interesting. You can see again the info is the shorter version of that. We can see the topic, subscription, and status. Then in this case, we can trigger some notifications by posting some encounters in progress. So if we send one, we can see what we posted. But in this case, we can see now we received an event notification. And if we want to look, we can actually see here was that event we just did. And so here we see the URL for encounter. This happens to be encounter 30. And we can see that it also included a reference to our patient. Down here, this is an optional thing, but we have this event $events operation that you can go and query for previous events and actually ask the server to change the content type since we're doing this in a live session. And in this case, you can see here we went back and queried, and we can see there was one event and all this additional information. You know, event number 1 had a focus resource of encounter 30 and additional context of patient 1. And then here are the actual resources because the server could return them and clean it. So kind of that's the quick walkthrough on the patient REST server. Patient REST endpoint is the same thing, but using a different endpoint. So if you are developing just the part that's the listening endpoint and you want to get your notifications on that, that you're standing up, you don't need a full UI. You're not building things that are creating subscriptions and doing all these things. You're just saying, I want to receive notifications. You can use this portion of the UI. It works the same way. You can see, you know, get a subscription topic list, select to create a patient. But now we're saying, we skip right to creating the subscription, and we're saying, hey, what's the URL of the REST endpoint? So you fill this in, and then you start posting encounters. Obviously, we're not displaying them in this UI because we don't have any way of getting them. So, you know, if you're setting up your own endpoint, Ruby, Python, C#, whatever it happens to be, you can use this to test sending those notifications. Do make sure the notifications, while the UI here can talk to your local host and everything else, the notifications are coming from a public server. So you will have to put in a valid URL that it can get to. Group REST, this is just doing the same thing as the patient REST, but it's doing groups instead of individual patients. And it's just to be able to go through and test something slightly different. The last tab here is the playground, and this is kind of the test whatever we can test. And so you can see there's a section at the top that shows whatever notifications we have. We can ask for events. We can't query because we don't have any subscriptions open yet. But we can get our list of subscription topics. We can manually create different endpoints. We can change the channel type. And so this is what I was talking about, that we have email, external REST hooks, client-hosted REST hooks, WebSockets, Zulip, all these different things that we can send and do. Expanded patient filtering, things like that. Here's the WebSocket connection, things like that. And then triggering notifications so that you can actually see them. So this is just kind of to be able to play with whatever you want. And again, you can connect this to your own server if you're developing a server, so that if you want to test your endpoints and creating and setting up your WebSockets and everything else, you can do that and use the playground to find all of that. So just so we can see, if we disconnect and say we're using the backport to R4, now we are connected to the R4 server and everything works the same, but we can see we are instead doing R4 instead of R5, and we're going to see some differences in things. Well, first we see different patients and things like that because we're using R4, and so there's a different backend server. But for instance, when we create the subscription, we can see there's a lot of extensions and things. So in R5, these were all built into the resource. In R4, they're not. And so we can see we have the criteria is the topic. Then we have this criteria extension that actually has the criteria as we were filling out before. We have some channel extensions for things that were added in R5, payload extensions saying we want ID only, all these different things. And again, this is all exposed here so that you can see and copy and do whatever you need. So we'll go through. I don't know what happened here that it didn't pass this through, so I will take a look at that before the Connectathon starts to make sure I didn't break anything in the most recent updates. But that is the reference implementation, and again, as I mentioned, there are links to everything, including all the GitHub links to this software itself. So if you have any questions or comments, please let me know, feature requests, etc., and hope to see you soon. Cheers.